Faith is the victory we know that overcomes the world.
Good evening. Glad to see everybody back this evening. All right. This evening we are back in Matthew chapter 5, where we've been for quite some time now. But today we're talking about something that fits very closely with the previous lesson. The previous lesson, of course, being lust and adultery. But then Jesus gets in verse 31 and he says, "It was said also, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that every one that putteth away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, maketh her an adulteress. And whosoever shall marry her when she is put away, committeth adultery." I think it's important for us to understand that marriage has never been a small thing to God. But unfortunately, it has become a small thing in our world. In our culture, the ending of a marriage is often treated like it's just a private lifestyle choice. It's just something that happens. It's just a little legal adjustment, just a change of status on a form. And no longer is what it once was. Just papers are signed and names are changed, and then life just moves on as normal. But Jesus shows us here in this text that putting away a spouse is not just a harmless reset button. It's not just something we can do whenever we feel like it. It is a moral act that has spiritual consequences. And so these words come in the middle of this Sermon on the Mount, and he's exposing that shallow righteousness of the Pharisees and other Jewish leaders, and he's calling his disciples to a deeper obedience, to a heart-level obedience. And having already dealt with anger and lust, he now turns to what happens when a covenant is broken, when a man decides to send away the wife he once vowed to love. See, the Jews of Jesus' day were not ignorant of the Scriptures. They read them and studied them all the time. They knew that Moses had spoken about divorce, and they knew there was such a thing that he had spoken of called a bill of divorcement. And so many of them just assumed that as long as the right formula was followed, as long as the correct document was given, then heaven was satisfied. Heaven's happy so long as we follow the legal procedures. But Jesus, in essence, is saying, you listened to what other people had to say about what Moses said, but rather than looking at what God really wrote. And so today we're going to look at that. First off, the letter of the law. Now, Jesus' quotation is not a verbatim quotation of Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, but rather it is a summary. It's a summary of the common rabbinic teachings of the day. And Jesus' quotation rather reflects what the scribes and the Pharisees of that day said, rather than what Moses actually said and what he meant. They had reduced this idea of divorce down to a mechanical act, down to just the giving of the document. The simple action alone met the legal obligation in the eyes of the Jews. But the problem was that they were quoting the letter of the law as they saw it, rather than looking at the purpose of the law and recognizing what it was actually trying to say. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and flip over to Deuteronomy 24, beginning in verse 1, and we'll look at what that law actually says. Beginning in verse 1, "When a man taketh a wife and marrieth her, then it shall be, if she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some unseemly thing in her, that he shall write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of the house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, who took her to be his wife, the former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance." So this is the passage, right? The basis that they were using as the Jewish divorce regulation. But there are some very important observations that we need to actually make about this text. First of all, this text is prescriptive. It is not descriptive, or it is descriptive rather than prescriptive. Moses is not commanding divorce here. right? He is not prescribing divorce to these people. He's not telling them, this is what you should, in this situation, you should divorce your wife. Rather, he is describing a situation that was taking place at the time. It starts off, when a man taketh a wife and marry her, and then it shall be that she find no favor in his eyes because of it. He's describing a situation that takes place, a practice that is already present. He is not prescribing that this is what you should do. In fact, what's interesting is the only command that is found in that text isn't found until verse 4 of the text. The only command that is actually in that text is that the former husband should not take the wife back. That's the only command there. The command against remarriage, not a command to divorce in the first place. So this passage where Moses is speaking is Moses regulating a situation that was already taking place among the people, that was already existing. Divorce wasn't something that was introduced by Moses. Divorce was already happening in Israel, and Moses was placing boundaries around it in order to protect the vulnerable. Now, the unseemly thing that is mentioned there is the phrase literally means a nakedness of a thing. It is an indecency or a shameful matter. It isn't supposed to mean any displeasure. It also certainly does not refer to adultery. Adultery had the death penalty, Deuteronomy 22 and verse 22. So this refers to some sort of indecency that is just short of a sexual sin. But the ambiguity of this phrase then led to the battleground of the Jews. What constitutes an unseemly thing and what doesn't? But I think it's important to recognize that the Jews looked at this text and they said, well, if there's an unseemly thing, then we can divorce her. But that's not what Moses was saying. That's not what he was commanding, and he never endorsed that. So then by the time that Jesus is now preaching this Sermon on the Mount, Deuteronomy 24 has been taken and has been debated for centuries. And this has resulted in two major schools of thought. There is There is the Shammai school, which is a strict school of interpretation. Rabbi Shammai taught that divorce was permissible only for serious sexual indiscretion, something that was approaching or equal to fornication. And he insisted that the phrase unseemly thing had a very narrow meaning. But then we have Hillel. Rabbi Hillel had a loose interpretation, and unfortunately it was the popular one. It was the one that taught that a man, if he found anything displeasing in his wife, could then divorce her for whatever matter that might be. This contained many different, very astonishing examples. If she burned a meal, if he got home and dinner was on the table, but it was black, then he could divorce her if he wanted to. Or if she spoke too loudly when he told her to be quiet, then he could divorce her. Or if he found someone just more attractive, then he could divorce her. And this is the school of thought. You see why it's popular, why it was popular among the Jews, because it gave these men the right to just run around with whoever they want. All they had to do was go through a legal process, get a piece of paper, and they were free. Hillel's school had effectively normalized this casual divorce. And so that was the situation into which Jesus is preaching. The result was this divorce on demand. It had become common. It had become socially acceptable. It had even become expected of people to divorce and remarry multiple times. And all of that was claimed to be justified by what Moses had said. And so that's what Jesus is confronting here. The people were saying, Moses said that so long as we give her a bill of divorcement, we're fine. But that wasn't what the old law said, and that certainly was not what Moses meant. So the letter of the law itself, there's this, the writing of divorcement is actually called a get in Hebrew. It is a legal document stating that the woman was released from a man's household and free to remarry. Now, when this was actually given by Moses, this bill of divorcement, it was intended to have a few purposes. It was intended to protect the woman from false accusations. So the husband couldn't claim that she had deserted him or she had run off with someone else. So it was also to protect her from being treated as though she was still bound. And it was also meant to serve as her proof of freedom. However, the problem, as we saw earlier, was that Moses didn't command this. This was something that had been given, but it was a man-made legislation. And if we have seen anything in our society, I don't know how much you look at what the world around us is turning into, but anything that is man-made can be easily twisted and turned and exploited and manipulated. And that's exactly what the Jews of the time were doing. Something that had originally been put into place in an attempt to protect women was then being used to run all over them. Now, the law of Moses commanding the death penalty for adultery shows that it had no intention of people getting divorced. It wasn't supposed to be regulated or documented because it wasn't supposed to exist. But because it did, this was an attempt by man to place some boundaries. But they had instead turned this idea into just a checklist allowing them to divorce for whatever reason they wanted, so long as they could provide a reason. It didn't have to be a good one, just a reason. And so they had reduced this thing, which was a sacred covenant between a man and a woman, they had reduced it to a legal transaction. And so that's what Jesus is answering here. That's what he is quoting here, is their accepted teaching. And he's showing them how that is wrong. Because the letter of the law is not intended to justify selfishness. It is intended to restrain it and to protect the vulnerable. So with that being said, what is the spirit of the law? I seem to have duplicated that slide. All right, the spirit of the law. Then Jesus goes on in verse 32, but I say unto you, right? That's the thing that keeps getting repeated over and over again in this section of Matthew chapter 5, right? I say unto you. And Jesus is drawing our attention away from the letter of the law that they were constantly teaching to the spirit behind the words that Moses actually taught. The Jews had mastered what they believed to be the letter of Deuteronomy 24, but had completely missed the heart that God had revealed in it. So this spirit of the law first has to begin with God's view of marriage. To understand the law concerning a divorce, we need to start where Jesus would. In Matthew 19 and verse 4, Jesus said, have ye not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female? Right? He looked at the beginning of time, before the law, before Deuteronomy or Moses, before even sin. God created marriage as a covenant, joining a man and a woman. God did the joining himself. This wasn't just a legal contract, right? This wasn't just a legal matter. It was certainly not disposable and not temporary. To make one flesh is never something that's supposed to be temporary. The two were supposed to be one flesh, as is said in Genesis 2:24. And then Jesus would later say in Matthew 19:6 that what God has joined, man should not separate. To be one flesh means to share in life and in purpose and in identity and future and covenant responsibility. And God would later say in Malachi 2 and verse 16 that he hates divorce. He hates the putting away. Not because he hates divorced people, of course. He hates the rupture of something that he himself has created and has made sacred. But then to look at God's view of marriage, I think one of the good places to go is the book of Hosea. Because in Hosea, God's emotional response to unfaithfulness is on full display. Hosea is a living parable of God's heart. So we looked at this a little bit a couple weeks ago. But God commanded Hosea to take Gomer, to take a woman who had made her living of fornication, and certainly wasn't going to cease doing so once they were married. That shows how Israel was unfaithful to God. Hosea 1 and verse 2. And that wasn't just a prophetic act, it was a window into God's soul. Because Hosea's heartbreak was God's heartbreak. As Gomer betrayed Hosea by running to her other lovers, by selling herself, by abandoning her home and forgetting the covenant, that was God saying, this is how my people are treating me. Hosea 2 and verse 8. So Hosea felt the anguish, the pain of that covenant being violated. And God feels that every single time someone is unfaithful. And that is the spirit of the law. That divorce is not just a legal act. It is a wound, a betrayal. It is a tearing apart of what God has joined. And with that in mind, God does not treat sending away lightly. Gomer left Hosea, but then Hosea was commanded to go and reclaim her in Hosea 3 and verse 1. But why? Why was Hosea sent to go bring Gomer back after all that she had done? The reason why is because that was how God loved. And that's how God continues to love. When Israel played the harlot, God did not cast them aside instantly. He bore with them. He stood by their side, even in their injustice and in their idolatry, in their rebellion and their coldness, in their betrayal and their ingratitude. Throughout all of that, he warned them and he called to them and he disciplined them and he reached and pleaded for them to come back to him. And in that, God's patience shows the spirit of the law. Marriage is supposed to reflect the covenant patience of God himself. But then, unfortunately, God did send away Israel. And when he did so, it broke his heart. Now, he never fully divorced Israel, so to speak, but he did send them away for a time. And in Jeremiah 3 and verse 8, he describes it as sending them away. He issued Israel that symbolic bill of divorcement in captivity of Babylon. And when he did so, though, he did so grieving. It wasn't that he wanted to do this, but it needed to be done because Israel had insisted on her unfaithfulness. Even in the midst of all of that, in Jeremiah 3 and verse 1, just before he gives Israel that symbolic bill of divorcement, he calls, "Return unto me," because he wants Israel to come back. Jesus, or God rather, never sent away his people casually. He never did so without tears, without his heart breaking. God himself views sending away with sorrow and reluctance. Divorce violates the spirit of covenant loyalty. Every covenant that God makes is anchored in loyalty and faithfulness and in steadfast love. One of the most important Hebrew words for understanding the spirit of marriage is the word hesed, which literally means loving kindness. But it means more than that. To the Jews, this is what represented their covenant loyalty. It underscored the uncontrovertible infidelity, or fidelity rather, of God to his word. Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9. It is God's love that never quits, that never stops fighting for his people. God's relationships are defined by this word, and marriage is supposed to be a mirror of it. Divorce, except where God himself gives exceptions, of course, denies loyalty. It denies that patience. It denies sacrificial endurance and covenant persistence. And that is why God hates divorce. Because marriage is a picture of his relationship with his people, and divorce destroys that. It springs from the hardness of the heart. Jesus would later say in Matthew 19 and verse 8, "Moses, for your hardness of heart, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it hath not been so." The hardness of heart is the antithesis of covenant faithfulness. The hard heart justifies itself. It refuses forgiveness and demands its own way. It rejects sacrifice. The spirit of the law condemns such thinking, though. In John 15 and verse 13, he wrote, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Love is duty. Love is sacrifice. It is obligation. It's responsibility for others. And that's what love has always been. Love has always been a sacrifice. The opposite, then, is the prioritization of oneself over others. It's when we prioritize our own comfort over that of the other party in our covenant. The spirit of the law demands the soft, the repentant, the faithful heart. It requires us to be patient and to be forgiving, not casual about the covenant that we've made. And the spirit of the law opposes casual divorce. The Jews treated this divorce as something convenient, but God never intended for it to be convenient or routine or selfish. It was never meant to become the cultural norm. The spirit of the law chokes this life out of the common practice of the time, because you cannot study the character of God and his feelings on divorce and come away that believing the casual practice of divorce is acceptable. Jesus placed a serious responsibility on the one who was doing the sending away. If you send away the innocent, then you share in the guilt of what happens next. Divorce isn't just a clean transaction. It harms souls and it burdens the innocent. It has consequences that aren't erased just by a piece of paper. God sees the trauma and the ripple effect, even as the Pharisees only saw paperwork. So we move on to the fulfillment of the law. You see, when Jesus is talking about this subject, speaking about divorce, he's not just issuing new regulations. He's revealing perfect righteousness, to the perfect righteousness to which the law pointed. He's demonstrating how he himself is the embodiment. He is the end. He is the perfection of all that God ever intended. Jesus fulfills the law by revealing its true demand. You see, the law demanded inward righteousness, but the people thought that it was just external compliance. The Pharisees were satisfied if they just gave that bill of divorcement, if they just followed the procedure, and they acted within the legal boundaries that they had established. But Jesus doesn't let that illusion continue to stand. Fulfillment means that the law is no longer a minimum requirement. We need to have our hearts transformed. Now the law is a window into the perfect holiness of God. And Christ shows us that marriage is something moral. It's not just legal. Nowadays I feel like everything requires a subscription. You get some kind of new electronic or anything, and it makes you make an account, and you have to make a subscription. If you want to use the device on the thing or the feature on the device you just bought, you have to buy that subscription. Well, I feel like a lot of times people treat marriage kind of like a subscription. Have you ever gotten a subscription where you just kind of get the free trial real quick, and then you hurry up and cancel before the free trial ends so you don't have to pay any of the actual money? I think a lot of times that's how our society views divorce, marriage and divorce. Our culture has treated it like it's just canceling a subscription. Like it's nothing serious, it's nothing important. We tried this out, we didn't like it very much, and so now we're done and we're going to move on with something else. And people now in our society speak of starter marriages the same way they speak of starter homes, assuming that the first one probably isn't going to last. You can find lawyers who advertise fast divorces or no-fault separation, as if ending a one-flesh union were just as simple as ending a phone contract. You might watch a movie or a TV show or something where a character walks away from marriage, and that might be praised as an act of self-care, of finding happiness. There's all this talk of, well, if it doesn't work out, it's fine. It's nobody's fault. You can just move on. Our culture has replaced commitment with convenience. They've traded a holy union that God created and turned it into just a legal arrangement that's easy to exit. Jesus said, "Everyone that putteth away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, maketh her an adulteress." That wasn't legal wording. That was moral wording. That was moral precision. Divorce is not morally neutral. There is no such thing as no-fault divorce in God's eyes. The law could regulate these outward actions, but Christ shows that there are still inward consequences. And Christ fulfills the law by condemning their legalistic loopholes. I probably missed a few of these up here. The Jews had twisted Moses' permission into a tool for selfishness. They were using God's law as a way to justify their own sin. But Jesus closed up every one of those loopholes. He replaced their technical righteousness with true righteousness. You can't hide behind what you think the law of Moses says. You can't shield your motives with procedure. Because the law wasn't this technical manual, it was a mirror that shows one the true state of their heart. And Christ also fulfills the law by modeling perfect covenant faithfulness. The law pointed to something that it could not produce, to perfect faithfulness. And Christ embodies that at perfection. The prophets compared God to a husband. Hosea in his faithful pursuit of Gomer. Isaiah in his declaration of God as a husband to his people. And Jeremiah in the sorrow of being betrayed by Israel. And Christ is the ultimate revelation of that divine faithfulness. John 13 and verse 1. And Christ doesn't send his bride away lightly. While God may have given that bill of divorcement to the apostate nation of Israel in Jeremiah 3 and verse 8, Christ demonstrates that God's ultimate desire to pursue and to restore and to forgive and redeem overrides all. Christ is that faithful bridegroom. He's the one who bears with us, who forgives us, who sacrifices himself for us. According to Ephesians 5:25 through 27, he is the one who sanctifies and cleanses his bride. The law could command behavior, but Christ is showing the heart of God behind the command. Not something that can be twisted or manipulated. He's showing God's character and God's perfection and holiness. So Christ's lesson here in just these two short verses really forces us to decide whose view of marriage we are going to carry. If we're going to carry with us the culture's view of marriage, just with a reversible routine sending away, or the Lord's, which treats it as a very grave act that has weight and sorrow. Jesus' words don't let us hide behind something like, well, we just grew apart, or it just didn't work out. He presses us to see that there are consequences to deciding these things. And so that teaches us some important things. For the married, it teaches us that we shouldn't be looking at this like, is there a way for me to get out? Is there an exit strategy? But rather, we should look at it as how better we can keep what we have vowed. And husbands, love your wives, right? Wives, be submissive to your husbands. It shows us, it teaches us to try to serve one another in the covenant in which we are. That's why all that we must do must be done in love, 1 Corinthians 16:14. And for the unmarried, that should impress upon us the importance of finding a good spouse. This isn't something that in God's eyes can just be overlooked, that can just be undone, with the snap of your fingers. This is important. This is a life-changing decision, and thus it means taking time. So, but the thing is, really, when it comes down to it, what Christ's words have really taught us is that sin always wounds more deeply than we could ever imagine. All of the things that we have seen so far in this Sermon on the Mount, it is Christ showing, even though you don't think it's hurting someone, it is. There are consequences to our actions. Whether we might be struggling in our home or in our heart or with our relationship with God, there are consequences. But the good news is that we can make it right. The good news is that Jesus has the kind of love that bears with us, that puts us first, that sacrifices for us. And he wants to forgive us. If we are struggling, he wants to help us, to comfort us. And so if you have any need this evening, we would love to be able to pray with you, to encourage you, if you would come as we stand and as we sing.